Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carrie Ingersoll-Wood, and I myself am an ex-Jehovah's Witness. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Education at Syracuse University, and I research the educational identity formation of first-generation students. As the first in my family to receive a degree, I'm really having a full circle moment right now here in Louisville presenting to you. My partner, who's here with me today, Jim, we used to live in Nashville, so just a couple of hours from here. And we used to attend district conventions for Jehovah's Witnesses here in Louisville. So this is a very different conference and convention than what we used to do in Louisville. I promise not to sing any kingdom songs to you. I would not be here this afternoon presenting academic research if it wasn't for the love and support of Jim. Like many who grew up in Jehovah's Witnesses, we were prevented from higher education after high school. And we worked a series of low-wage, blue-collar jobs to support our family and make ends meet. Jim attended a trade skills program. And during high school, he also had dreams and aspirations, but instead he turned those into skill sets that he could support his family with. And I graduated a year early to become a full-time pioneer, but because I was dating Jim, they didn't let me. But that's a different story. We can talk about that some other time. Our lives changed significantly when Jim was laid off from his job at Pepsi. So there we were two young parents. At the time, we had 2 kids and only our high school educations between us. And at the time, New York State was offering a program for Jim to go to college and earn a degree. And that was very no inside of Jehovah's Witnesses at the time. It was still forbidden, but he did it anyway. And we got a lot of pushback from the elders. But he, in that educational awakening of his own, he discovered that it would be a shame if I didn't go to school too. So because this was quite some time ago, he got the paper application, wrapped it up like a present, and brought it home to me and said, "You have got to go to college. I mean, you'll be wasting your mind if you don't go." So I told you this whole story to let you know that while Jim was going to school, he had an awakening educationally, and we were starting to come out of Jehovah's Witnesses at that point. I got pregnant for our 3rd child, also life-changing. And then that's when our stories took flight and we left together. Because of his strength and support, I've been able to pursue an academic dream, and I'm honored to share a portion of my research with you here today. And I want to acknowledge first that I have been lifted up by other academic ex-JW women. And through their sharing of experience and scholarship and storytelling, I have grown exponentially in their mentorship. That was not something I received inside of the congregation ever. We were never encouraged to support one another. None of the women ever told me about careers. It was always talking about becoming mothers and parenting and what we looked like. There was never any emphasis on developing our minds. So let's take an academic journey. As an educational philosopher, John Dewey noted that education is transformative. And historically speaking, education through organization has liberated individuals from oppression through activism. It's relieved society from the ravages of disease through scientific discovery, and it's transported humans to celestial realms through pioneering inquiry. Education, when democratically employed, aids in a positive transformation of an individual. And while I was earning my bachelor's degree, I took a course in educational philosophy. And the final assignment in that course required I write my own educational philosophy to explain how and what I would like to teach my future students. I saw teaching as not something that I came to naturally, but everyone else did. They're like, "You're going to be a teacher?" So there I went. In that assignment, I wrote how I wanted to teach my students the truth. And since truth has become so subjective in the United States, that is why my professor pushed back on that statement. Like all educators, he saw the coming questioning of truth through the lack of educational supports that teachers were receiving. And he thought wisely to interrogate my own motivation to teach truth, warning me about the very thing that had happened to me about indoctrinating students. In a note on the margin of one of my papers, he asked me, "What do you mean when you want to teach your students the truth?" And his question pushed me to reconsider my own philosophy, and it's the genesis of my research. So his question, really, it was the first course in educational philosophy, and I was just cutting my teeth with curriculum development and theory. But what did I mean? What did I mean? To explain, I've divided my presentation into two parts. Part one will explain the theory that underpins my research, and part two will illustrate the lived experience of individuals who, like me, grew up learning what they could or could not be. And I was born and raised in the truth, a term Jehovah's Witnesses use to shape their members' views of education they receive from the organization. And from infancy, I learned through publications, presentations, and educational training materials, like Benefit from Theocratic Ministry School Education Guidebook, designed to cement in my mind and the minds of all members the importance of my spiritual education. That education superseded the one that I was receiving in primary and secondary school. And when I was writing my educational philosophy, I was speaking out against the indoctrination I experienced inside of JWs, that secondary learning environment. By coding their teachings as the truth, Jehovah's Witnesses positioned themselves and their religious beliefs over secular education. And their theocratic ministry school, through simulations and those pseudo study materials, fostered need-thwarting environments devoid of supports for individual growth that stripped individuals of their autonomy and wounded their critical thinking skills. When I wrote that I wanted to tell my future students the truth, I was trying to really speak about this current research, and I didn't know it really yet. I could feel it, but I didn't know it. And I wanted future students to explore their own intrinsic interests and not spend their lives as recruiters for a religious organization. To understand and articulate to individuals what I and many others had experienced growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, I used DC and Ryan's self-determination theory as a lens, because the tenets of self-determination theory have been investigated in diverse educational settings, and they reinforce the importance of implementing motivational supports to enhance need satisfaction and autonomy relatedness in students, especially the basic issues of personality development, self-regulation, life goals and aspirations, and the impact of social environments on the motivation of the individual. Their affect, it affects their behavior, their well-being, every single choice they make. So SDT seemed like the perfect theory for this. According to SDT, intrinsic motivation pertains to activities that are done by an individual for their own sake or for their inherent interest and enjoyment. Play, exploration, and curiosity-spawned activities exemplify intrinsically motivated behaviors, as they are not dependent on extrinsic incentives or pressure, but rather those provide their own satisfaction and joy. In contrast, extrinsic behaviors within an individual are done for purposes outside of that individual's inherent interests. And since extrinsic motivation can vary widely, SDT specifies 4 major subsets of extrinsic motivation as illustrated in the table. These 4 subsets of external regulation represent behaviors that range from non-autonomous to controlled motivation to an integrated form of autonomous extrinsic motivation. The difference between intrinsic motivation and integrated regulation is that an individual recognizes the value in the activity or task that they are required to do because it aligns with their interests of a value system. But the task does not bring them joy, as is the case with intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation also plays a key role in the academic achievement and persistence of students. Students who possess higher levels of intrinsic motivation have better study habits, they persist in their studies, and they display more adaptive cognitive strategies that assist in their positive educational identity formation. By contrast, students who are exposed to only extrinsic motivators, such as rewards for performance or compliance, they fare poorly in their overall academic or educational development. In other words, what a learner is doing and why determines their personal development. And I want you to keep this in mind for part 2. And I promise we're almost done with the heavy lifting. So why does all of this matter? We're talking about the goal pursuits and self-determination of behavior. What we're talking about is what Jehovah's Witnesses are teaching their youth to do and what they can become. And they're doing it through what they like to call repetition for emphasis. If you're a former witness, you are very familiar with this phrase. And the why of the individual's goal pursuits makes a difference in terms of those educational outcomes. They intentionally and repetitiously expose youth and individuals to content designed to extrinsically influence performance from an individual for the benefit of the society they belong to, which frustrates the individual's psychological need for autonomy and control, and it teaches that person to seek approval, rather than orient themselves through autonomous goal-directed behavior. So, basic psychological needs. Basic psychological needs theory specifies that a learner's satisfaction of autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs are linked directly to their well-being. Essentially, if a learner feels like they have autonomy and agency, and they feel competent and connected to their learning without any external regulation, there's no punishment, they have an overall psychological health that fares better, and it positions them well for achieving those intrinsic goals to live a satisfying day-to-day life. Why is this so important inside of this presentation? Because Jehovah's Witnesses orient themselves with their family and their community, and that educational identity formation is tied to the community. The extent to which the individual will feel connected can negatively impact their long-term aspirations. And aspirational goal setting was something that every person who I interviewed struggled to define if they were very involved inside of Jehovah's Witnesses, especially women. So that's an implication for future research, the gendered identities that are created inside of this group. Okay, that was a lot of talk about motivation theory, but I wanted you to have a really good grasp on motivation because it applies to the lived experience of all the individuals who were repeatedly exposed to curriculum that employs external rewards and punishments to foster cooperation, and it has long-lasting negative effects on individuals who internalize those compulsion mechanisms. All right, we get to the fun part, the story time. Before Jim and I left Jehovah's Witnesses, one morning we were driving home from a Sunday meeting. All the kids are strapped in the car. And I remember asking him, when will we be happy? You see, that was something that Jehovah's Witnesses talked about all the time, was your future happiness. And happiness was always a goal that we had to get to. And so for us, happiness was always off in the future. And as we were driving home from the Kingdom Hall, it struck me that this is really time consuming and hard. And so when do we get to the happy part? And at the time, neither of us had a profession. And as I mentioned earlier, we only had high school educations between us, and we were living paycheck to paycheck. And we were in this business of suspending our present happiness to a future that we could never fully realize. And we had the pressure to perform, and we did it really well. We were the ideal family. I dressed us in coordinating outfits. We sat in the second row. I taught our children to read early, and they could answer very well. And that was something that we were trying to model. We were trying to emulate that. And I thought that that would bring us happiness. We went out regularly in the door-to-door field work. Our children then started witnessing to their friends in school. And we started to realize this wasn't really joyful. We realized that we were living this life of regulated duty. And though we loved each other and our kids very deeply, our lives lacked depth and purpose. So I think this quote is a really good segue into examining the educational practices of witnesses and what they do and how, the methods they use to instruct their members. And I think it's overarching for the entire conference because we've been talking about and listening to the experiences of individuals who have been relegated to this parental rights and trust. And we talked about it this morning in a session. We're like, but what if the parents want to raise the kids in that way? Those are what's called parental rights and trust. So let's take a look at how that impacts a child's psychological development and how they can see themselves off into the future. Knowing that Feinberg, who was actually writing about witnesses and the Amish community inside of this paper that I quoted from, and if you're familiar with him, I had only really seen an excerpted, edited version of this paper. And so later on, when I was writing for my PhD, I saw the full version. And it kind of struck me that this guy will write this thing. And he was really for Jehovah's Witnesses being able to let my parents say that I couldn't have freedom of mind, I couldn't have freedom of choice. And if they wanted me to only grow up and be a pioneer, well, then so be it. It's a little sad. All right, let's talk about preference falsification. It's one of my favorite terms. Does anyone know what this is an image of? Go ahead. Ostracon, that is where we get the word ostracism. Exactly. It's an ostracon. It's a pottery shard that's used as a ballot in ancient Athens. You're absolutely right. And they used it to expel people for 10 years from someone who was deemed to be a danger or a political threat. And then that's where we get the word ostracism. So you ostracize someone because they do not comply with the group. So I and my husband have been ostracized by Jehovah's Witnesses as apostates. Ironically, now that they identify as jw.org, for looking up information on the internet. That was before they rebranded. So that's ironic. But anyway, we were labeled as apostates. We openly and actively questioned their hypocritical association with the United Nations as a non-governmental organization so that they could gain access to countries that required NGO status for their ministry. So when we were Jehovah's Witnesses, we were practicing preface falsification. By every time someone asked us what you wanted to be when you grew up, you would lie about it because you didn't want your friends or neighbors to know what that was. You didn't want them to know that you were actually very interested in something very different than what we were doing. So belonging to this image, to this organization, negatively impacted our autonomous and aspirational goal setting. We started to display ought-based behaviors, and we were doing what we should be doing according to the organization instead of what was coming from us. As many may know, Jehovah's Witnesses owe much of their success to horizontal and vertical development and recruitment. So congregations are made up of families, and they use emotional regulation to connect to that belonging and relationships. And they use effective forecasting in order to keep their people inside of the group until they get to baptism. Because once you get someone baptized, as my study relayed, that individual is then held to those behavioral expectations of the group, and then they become a formal member of this fictive kinship. Then you are a brother, and you are a sister, and you are formally recognized inside the community. Skip ahead. So emotional forecasting of happiness, what is this? It's that future happiness that's eternal and corrective, and you are taught that you'll be able to manage all of your current struggles by imagining this endless, satisfying life with all the time in the world to develop these hobbies. But you don't have that time now because you need to go knock on some more doors and get to people to become a Jehovah's Witness. That your paradise will restore all of the things that are part of your human experience today. That emotional forecasting is a regulation strategy they use for the here and now, obviously. Okay, so I just want to give a trigger warning that if you have not seen the Caleb and Sophia videos, I think it's important for you to see these so that you can see a technique that Jehovah's Witnesses use to target youth. This particular video speaks about and highlights their very homophobic views. So I just kind of wanted to tell you that before I share the video.
Look, Mom, I drew our family in school today.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have time to finish Caleb's face. Carrie drew two mommies. She told me they're married to each other. My teacher says that all that matters is that people love each other and that they're happy.
Well, people have their own ideas about what is right and wrong. But what matters is how Jehovah feels. He wants us to be happy, and he knows how we can be happiest. That's why he invented marriage the way he did.
You mean one man and one woman?
Exactly. Look at Genesis 1:27. Jehovah created Adam and Eve, male and female. Then in Genesis 2:24, he said that a man will stick to his wife. Later, Jesus said the same thing. Jehovah's standards haven't changed. It's kind of like going on an airplane. What would happen if someone wanted to bring something on the plane that wasn't allowed?
They couldn't go on their trip.
Right. It's the same with Jehovah. He wants us to be his friend and live in paradise forever. But we have to follow his standards to get there. At Matthew 7:13 and 14, it talks about the road leading to paradise. To get there, Jehovah says we have to leave some things behind. That means anything Jehovah doesn't approve of.
But I want everyone to get to paradise.
So does Jehovah. And you know what? People can change. That's why we share his message. So, what can you say to Carrie?
Well, I could tell her about the paradise. I could tell her about the animals and the resurrection.
That's awesome. Let's practice.
Right. So that's the emotional regulation through social sharing. There are also cognitive reappraisal of life choices that witnesses use to recruit. And it asks individuals to shed their identities that are linked with their families and their former communities in order to have this mobile social identity via higher education that they establish through the Bethel family. And I think it's interesting that a lot of these high control groups use Bethel as their lofty educational goals. Witness children are encouraged to shift their focus from secular education in order to develop their talents and interests towards this service-based voluntary role within their belief-based education centers to pursue careers that allow them to work part-time so they can participate in the full-time ministry. In the interest of time, I'm not going to share this video, so we'll click through it. Does anyone know who this is a picture of? Yes, this is Philip Brumley. He's the lead attorney for Jehovah's Witnesses, and I don't have time to share his statement. Maybe I can get squeak out a couple minutes.
You're an attorney, you serve at Bethel. Undoubtedly, young people have come to you asking your opinion on this. What do you tell a young person who's considering pursuing higher education?
Well, the first thing that anyone should do is to ask themselves, to closely examine themselves as to the motive. Is the motive really to seek first the kingdom, to use some additional schooling to facilitate pioneering or serving at Bethel or serving where there's a greater need? Or actually is the motive one of obtaining a certain standard of living or a certain degree of prominence? So the real core issue is why is an individual obtaining this additional training? The second thing for someone to keep in mind is to be focused on what they really are going to learn. To attend a university, learning things that have little to do with what one can do to earn a living really serves no purpose. On the other hand,
Let's just cut him off there. This is a picture of me at the 1988 convention that was at Yankee Stadium. And I, like many youth, our parents believed every direction that came from Jehovah's Witnesses. So they limited our educational outcomes. And it comes with a sense of guilt and obligation. And then through those restriction environments, there's regulation and need thwarting, and individuals suffer psychological side effects such as inner conflict, alienation, anxiety, depression. And those needs that are thwarted at an early age, those individuals try to compensate by attempting to attain a sense of self-worth, by pursuing image-related goals, or possibly through the accumulation of money or material possessions, all of which are compensations that are considered sinful by JW standards. I just want to close by talking about how witnesses construct literacy practices within their meetings. Witnesses position themselves as educators. However, witness publications do not encourage critical thinking. Members are repeatedly put in that position of ignorance and are instructed to use the correct answers from their materials. And this type of instruction crushes critical thinking and programs individuals to constantly monitor how they should think, what they should say, what they should believe, who they should associate with, and the list goes on. This was just seems like a statement that we all would embrace, that preventing a child from that long-term ramification has long-term ramifications in their lives. Areas for future research. I'm also looking at disabled, gendered, and queer identities, the enslaved generations, because they talk a lot about the generations that belong, and the misuse of legal and political systems in order to foster cooperation from the courts for freedom of speech for them, and then also trying to protect themselves from a lot of legal lawsuits. Anybody have any questions? You can find me. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or any of your thoughts. Thank you for being such a great audience.